Welcome again to the third of our lectures in the series Making Sense of Complexity. That's the lecture series of the new School of Complex Adaptive System, where initially our faculty is introducing themselves and their research topics to you all, with the hope of triggering interesting discussions and future collaborations. Here's a brief reminder of the upcoming seminars. The next three by Eric, Derek, and Brian. You see the titles here. But today's talk is by our very own Michael Barton, who doesn't need a lot of introduction, but I will give a short one anyway. Michael's topic reflects a lot of his research here, computing complexity from the past and future of a socio-natural planet. He's a trained archaeologist, expert modeler, and a long-time leader of all of our efforts in building up complex systems at ASU. And he also currently agreed to serve as the associate director for students in the new school. So without further ado, I hand it over to Michael. Brief reminder, everybody mute their microphones, please.
Yeah, except me. I'll try to leave mine on. I forget to turn off my mute. Thanks, Manfred. It's nice to see you all here in tiny little squares. And maybe next year we'll see you in person when we continue this series. So following up what Manfred said, I'm trying and present a couple of areas that are important in my research right now, or activities, especially related to complex systems. And as Manfred said, you know, my training is in both social and natural sciences and anthropology and geosciences, where they collide in what's now called geoarchaeology. I've been interested in long-term dynamics of societal or systems and applying what's kind of be called extended evolutionary principles to understand these kind of dynamics, and increasingly computational methods apply that to human systems research. And I do field work in the Mediterranean and the US. You know, it's one of the few field pictures they have of me, since I'm the one that's taking the pictures mostly. This gives me something of maybe a unique perspective as a historical scientist. I notice a lot of other historical scientists are in this meeting today, in this webinar. But I just want to point out that actually a few millennia ago, most people lived in small communities, and any individual could make sense of their world, especially the social world, natural world, be able to understand the consequences of their actions, both on their other people in the society and also on the part of the natural world that they interacted with, whether hunter-gatherers or farmers. They have some sense, and we're good at this. We're actually pretty good at understanding social and ecological systems. But this isn't the case anymore. The world has changed dramatically. And in a few short millennia, we've changed from being a normal mammal, a successful one spread all over the world, to some kind of a unique, I'd say, global phenomenon. You know, not just a normal animal, but there's like getting close to 8 billion people on the planet. For even small animals, that's a lot. For large animals like this, that's enormous. Most of us live in these urban hives, over half the population. Phoenix, being close to 5 million people, is one of the smaller one of those, but it surpasses the size of almost any other social group size in the animal kingdom. We live in a world now that is connected by digital media, rapid transportation. Of course, this has shown up dramatically and painfully in the current pandemic, but it connects everybody economically and socially with these and environmentally in this planetary network of multiple cross-cutting relationships. And so we've created this highly complex social natural system. That's what we live in now. And it's a world that we have generated, and it's unprecedented. There's other animals that are keystone species, but we are more than a keystone species in how we have transformed and affected this planet. And in this kind of a world, it's dominated by these telecoupled processes, both human and biophysical. Now, I feel, and other people too, that we're confronted with a really unique challenge. And we can no longer depend upon our intuition to manage the local gardens and local ecosystems that we've dealt with for so long and so successfully. But we have to somehow manage and do it in a sustainable way, dynamics of an entire planet, a planetary socio-ecological technological system that we have created ourselves, something that nobody's done before. If we're not doing a very good job of it, it's not necessarily because we're incompetent or bad intended, but we've never done this before. In fact, no creature on the planet has ever done this. So how do we successfully do these things? As a historical scientist, I of course hope that we can gain insights from the past, from past socio-ecological system dynamics, to give us some better way, some knowledge that we can apply to meet these challenges of the future. But there's an interesting thing in that both the past and the future are very similar in some respects, in that they're both invisible. We can see the present, but we cannot observe the past, and we cannot observe the future. Of course, without a time machine, maybe we'll get one of these days, but I don't know of one yet. We can, of course, observe the consequences, the present consequences of those invisible past processes, the things we can't see. And of course, we can observe processes today that will produce invisible future consequences, things we can't see in the future, the invisible future. And of course, we can sort of imagine what life might have been like in the past by looking at these present consequences of the invisible past. And we can imagine what the future might be like by imagining the future consequences of the visible present. But if we're going to try and successfully and sustainably manage a global socio-ecological system, then I think it requires more than just imagination, no matter how inspired we might be. Humans have always used technologies to augment our biological capacity. This goes back a couple million years, so it's part of the human niche to use technologies. And the scale and complexity of these challenges of managing a complete planetary socio-ecological system, I feel requires that we also use technologies to augment our inherent capacities for information processing. And we've seen in the last few decades that computation and modeling has been applied increasingly to augment our ability to imagine the past and the future and try to leverage these innate abilities to comprehend social and natural systems. And so what I want to do today is talk about some of my journey or experience in applying these approaches to both understanding the past and past system dynamics, and to try and enable future kinds of information technologies in a way that can give us leverage to help us better face the challenges we face with at a planetary scale. So I'm going to start out with the past. And this phrase by Peter Kareva I really like, and that we live on a domesticated planet. Certainly everybody, at least people that are interested in the environment and human impact, are very concerned about climate change. And that's a big aspect of what the Global Futures Laboratory is focused on. And of course we should be. I mean, will have a major impact on everybody's lives, but it is just one dimension of how people have transformed the planet. Growing crops, herding animals, things we call agriculture, has, I'd say, at least an equally significant transformational consequences for the planet. And maybe these consequences are even more immediate than those of climate change. We face these consequences today. But on top of this, agriculture makes a significant contribution to changing climate, and perhaps has for a very long time. Brief history lesson, only with one slide, but that is agriculture was independently invented in a bunch of different places at about the same time, from my perspective as a historical scientist, in the first half of the Holocene. We don't see it before then. This is when it shows up. It set off a cascade of positive feedbacks between people and their environment cascade of feedbacks that are not seen in other animals, except maybe some ants. And these feedbacks are continuing to shape and reshape human society and our relationship with the natural world in ways today. Agriculture rapidly replaced the normal way for people to make a living in the past. We call it hunting and gathering, but this is what normal mammals do. And now we can't get along without it. There's no going back, right? There's no way to support 8 billion people by hunting and gathering on the planet. It's increased global carrying capacity. There's no way that hunting and gathering alone would even end up with nearly 8 billion people on the planet. So a tiny minority of people who are actually producing food, farmers, actually support a much larger majority of non-farmers doing all kinds of things, including us here, as well as the ability to develop and utilize complex technologies. It's the basis for our urban life, where half the people on the planet live. This is an ant-like life, again, totally different from any other mammal on the planet and different from almost every other animal. A few factoids. Over half the planet's terrestrial surface is now managed for agriculture, cropland and rangeland. If we were to include forestry in that, it would be the majority of the habitable part of the planet. One of my favorite web comics is one called XKCD. This is one that came out some years ago. I colorized it for you all, but point out that just the weight, the sheer weight of us, plus our agricultural biomass, right, which is over 3 billion tons a year, weighs more than all other vertebrates on the planet combined. All of them, including all the fish in the sea. Right? It's only if we start including invertebrates do they actually outweigh us. And it's kind of freaky. More terrestrial sediment is moved by human activity than natural activity. More nitrogen is cycled by human activity than non-human activity. Over half the surface fresh water is used by people, and most of this is associated with farming, with agriculture. It's had a significant long-term impact on climate change. Work by Bill Rudiman and others have demonstrated, I think, pretty conclusively that agriculture, really started out the kind of climate alteration, global climate alteration, that has been greatly magnified in the last 2 centuries. It's certainly fossil fuels and the Industrial Revolution had a huge impact, but it started 6,000 years ago. And we can see this in, if we look at the last 8 interglacials, which the Holocene is one, we can look at the trend of CO2 or methane and other kinds of gases. There's a general trend. The Holocene just goes off the chart when people started farming. So we started modifying the atmosphere through farming a long time ago. And so how did this happen? How did we quit being normal and end up being ecosystem managers at a global scale, living an ant-like life in these urban hives? And what will be the impact of this future? These are the kind of fundamental questions that some of my major research is trying to answer, at least get at, the Mediterranean Landscape Dynamics Project. And so I'll talk about that a little bit here to start with. And to a lot of extent, this kind of really launched me into thinking explicitly about complex adaptive systems with this project, beginning in the early 2000s. And so I'm actually tried to utilize complex systems methods and thinking in designing and carrying out this project. So we're combining computational modeling with empirical field work to understand the emergence of these coupled natural and human landscapes, the kind of landscapes that dominate the planet today. We're focused in the Mediterranean, where we have study areas, field study areas across the Mediterranean. You can go see our wimpy little website if you want at medland.asu.edu. And of course, no talk by an archaeologist would be complete without at least a few field pictures to show that we don't dig much in square holes, but we do go out and do things in the dirt and are out on the landscape And so these are all, I think, in Spain. Don't have any pictures in this batch from Jordan or Italy. But we use a variety of methods to try and collect both information about past human systems and past environmental systems and their changes and their interactions. We also, along with this, have built a simulation modeling laboratory called the Medlin Modeling Laboratory that we use to try and evaluate different kinds of scenarios about the interaction of people and the environment, smallholder farmers and their impact on landscapes, and then how those impacts fed back into the dynamics of human society. And this is just a little schematic to let you show that there's many components to this where we put together models of farmer behavior and landscape evolution and vegetation and things like this. So we're trying to replicate a piece of this complex coupled socio-ecological system. Not everything, but enough pieces of it to try and understand the dynamics of these systems. And this allows us to begin to ask questions about what happened and what could have happened and why and how did these things happen and how can we recognize them. So I wanted to give you just a couple of examples of this today in this talk, and focus on research that we've focused in Eastern Spain. Both of these examples come from an area in southern Valencia, the Comunidad Valenciana in northern Alicante province in the valley of the Rio Penagula in Spain. So it's a really pretty place to work. So I have great colleagues. We've worked together for decades there, and it's been a really, really rewarding area. But this has been kind of a really good place to understand and to try and focus research on the emergence of these coupled natural and human landscapes. And of course, you look at the landscape today, we can see it definitely is a coupled natural and human landscape. I mean, rain falls, water flows, plants grow, but people have reshaped it and organized it and affect where some of those plants grow and how they grow and where the animals are and things like that. So it is this joint human and natural landscape. To kind of give you a sense, a little bit of color on how this works, this is an example of how we try to do this. We set up a landscape, a digital landscape, and in this case, we're trying to have a digital landscape that matches a real world one. So this one is a digital replica, the digital elevation model of the Rio Penagula watershed. And then we've put down a village, a farming village, and actually we've picked a location where there was one prehistorically about 6,000 years ago or so, so that we know people did live there. And then we allow, then we set up the model so that they can do small scale farming, herding sheep and goats, collecting firewood, and then responding to changes in the environment. And then they go ahead, and this alters their behavior, which then alters the environment. So we have this kind of coupled feedbacks. And here we can see with colors, just kind of change in land use. And we can't run this for thousands, hundreds or thousands of years. Is it someone saying something there? Don't forget to mute your mic because all kinds of things can happen in the background. And then we can also, we can repeat these I think of these as computational experiments, okay? Replicating things that may have happened, but to help us understand dynamics. And because they're experiments, we can change the parameters of those experiments and ask different kinds of questions. So to give you an example, one of the questions we have for this area is there are these big features called barrancos. And that's a generic name for kind of eroded water courses. And of course, some of these are huge valleys that have eroded over millions of years. But there's a lot of them, like in this picture here, and there's actually a person standing right there, if you can see my pointer, which seem to have appeared during the Holocene after the beginning of farming. And there's a kind of a general consensus that they probably had something to do with anthropogenic impacts on landscape. But people have studied erosion and gullying in this part of the world and elsewhere over periods of a few years to even a decade. And of course, geologists have studied the formation of valleys and uplift over the course of millions of years, but no one has been able to try and understand how these features, which are common throughout the Mediterranean, not just in Spain, but in Italy and in the Eastern Mediterranean, where they're called wadis, exist. Where do you get these erosional features and how do they show up? And so we carried out a series of experiments and reported this one. The place we published it is in How to Make a Barranco. So the goal was to, can we make a barranco? Can we generate the kind of erosional features here through different kinds of smallholder farming, herding, and land use in this area? So we set up a digital environment. We put a small farming hamlet there with a few households. We gave them a catchment where they could do shifting cultivation, go out and farm a field to lose its fertility and then let it fallow while they farm a different one. And then a larger grazing catchment where people could herd sheep and goats. And that's what we see here. And we ran it for 300 years to see, that was our experimental time. In all of our experiments, we also run control experiments with no people because landscapes are dynamic without people. Right? Water falls from the sky, gravity happens, plants grow, plants die, right? And there's animals there. So we ran a couple of different control experiments representing a couple of different climate regimes. One is a normal Mediterranean regime where the area was covered in Mediterranean woodland. And another was one that was drier and the landscape was covered in very sparse herbaceous vegetation, so much more susceptible to erosion. So we set up these as a couple of control experiments and compared those with the ones with people on the landscape. And I'm just going to show you one of the human experiments, the one that I think had the most impact, and it's interesting. I'm going to start with the natural one, right? So we have two different scenarios. And what we're looking at here in these graphs, right, is the cumulative amount of erosion on the bottom in meters, so average meters of erosion over time. And the top, the average meters of deposition, because sediment, dirt that's eroded from one place ends up someplace else. And so when it's eroded from hill slopes, it can fill up eroded valleys, right? Or you can also erode those valleys, so it can be lost or added. So, and we actually divided the landscape up into channels and hill slopes to look at those comparisons. So, right, the ones here, so this little line here, this set of dashes, right? This is the cumulative amount of erosion in a Mediterranean woodland landscape. And this is the cumulative amount of deposition in the channels. So there's a little bit of erosion over time, a little bit more deposition in time. Okay, that makes some sense. And over here, if we look on hill slopes, there's a little bit of erosion over time and there's a little bit of deposition over time. It's a pretty stable landscape. And if anything, there's it's pretty stable in general. If you look at denuded landscapes, right, ones that are covered with very sparse herbaceous vegetation, right, we get a little bit more erosion in the channels, but a lot more deposition in the channels. So that means the hill slopes are eroding and they're filling up the channels. When you have a climate-driven denuded landscape, right? If we look on the hill slopes, there's a fair amount of erosion on the hill slopes and a little bit of deposition on the hill slopes. So in the channels, climate-based denudation, right, fills up the channels and erodes the hill slopes. A short answer. So what happens when we put people in the landscape? Well, kind of almost the opposite happens. So anthropogenic erosion in the channels is enormous. There's also a fair amount of deposition, but not much more than you get from climate-driven denudation, right? But a lot more erosion. However, on the hill slopes, human activity doesn't have much more impact than a regular Mediterranean woodland without people there at all. Climate-driven vegetation change has a lot more impact. So one thing neat about this is if we were going to go back in the past and try to look at signatures of human activity, look for them. probably, at least for small scale farmers, they have a much bigger impact on erosion in channels, that is the creation of barrancos, and a much less impact on hill slope erosion. Whereas climate-driven changes have much more, do not create barrancos, they actually fill them up and have somewhat more impact on hill slopes. Well, so we're involved in a paper with some people, and we brought up this example, and this came out of a series of meetings, which I'll talk about in a minute. And in this, the question is to what extent is it worthwhile to try and model the bidirectional feedbacks between people and biophysical processes? You can model them separately, and that's what's widely done right now in things like the IPCC report. They model the potential future, looking at biophysical processes, model people separately in economic models, and then take some information from the economic models and throw them into the biophysical models as different initial parameters to see what would happen under different conditions, right? But no feedbacks between them. And there's argument that there's a lot of computational cost in doing bidirectional feedbacks. So maybe we don't need to do that. So we could actually test that in our modeling laboratory. So we did. We did 3 scenarios. The first scenario, the idea is that just like in the IPCC, we would have different land use scenarios and put them in as kind of initial conditions to a set of landscape evolution models, right? So this is the first one, human system, and one impact, and then we see this model happen here. The second set of experiments is that we would run a human system model, farming model, and it would actually put information into the landscape evolution model at regular intervals. And so that was the second one. So here we can, it regularly puts stuff in, and both models move along. The models operate independently, but we keep getting new updated information from the human system model. And then the last one was it's the one that I kind of showed you, was a kind of model like this, where people do things, it alters the landscape, it changes their ability to farm, or where they can farm and where they can herd sheep and goats. And so they respond to this, and they change what they're doing, which changes the impact on the landscape, which changes what people are doing. So bidirectional feedbacks. And so it sort of looks like this. And so we have these, and so the landscape change is impacting the human systems, and human systems are impacting landscape change. So what's the result? Well, some more graphs, right? You like graphs. The first graph, one at the top, is the normal IPCC one. So we have a bunch of different initial scenarios, and we have these erosion and deposition maps, and different land use scenarios produce different outputs. And I put on we also ran the control experiments here. You can see them for reference. And some had more erosion than without people. Some had less. A lot of them had more deposition without people. Some had less. Different scenarios for different outputs. Okay, that's good. We know that. But what about if you have one-way feedbacks moving? So constantly human activities are affecting the landscape. We have a different pattern. This one just has one. We just worked with one initial setup and ran it multiple times. Right? You can't see much variation in this because it didn't make much change. But one thing we can see is that we see a shift in the slope of erosion and deposition. And this represents a type of regime change when when vegetation shifts from being primarily Mediterranean forest to mixed shrubland that's common today. So when we put in at least one kind of feedback between people and the environment, we can suddenly see regime shifts that we can't see when we don't do that. When we add 2 bidirectional feedbacks, we can see the regime shifts, but in a single configuration, remember multiple times, the outcomes are really variable. Same initial parameters. So now we can see all the different kinds of uncertainty in the outcomes. And in some cases, the results are not much different than without people there. And in some cases, they're really different than without people there. So if we're trying to plan ahead and use modeling to understand the future, it's probably a good idea to be able to identify potential tipping points and regime shifts and understand the uncertainty in our predictions so that we can prepare for that kind of uncertainty and the potential uncertainty in the behavior of complex socio-ecological systems. So to flip over to the second half of this talk, I want to point out that this project, when started out with a pretty large NSF grant, had a number of other outcomes besides the research that's still ongoing for the Medellin project. One of them, it ended up getting me involved with the initial creation of the Center for Social Dynamics Complexity, where I'm now the director, and eventually led to my participation, as Manfred said, in the creation of the School of Complex Adaptive Systems. I'm not going to talk about that. We can talk about that another time. Maybe someday over beers if you want. Happy to go into that story. What I'm going to talk about is a different outcome is now driving kind of an international research program on the future of modeling. And this deals with ComSysNet and the Open Modeling Foundation. ComSysNet, which is the network for computational modeling in social and ecological sciences, started out as a discussion, a debriefing after an NSF large program review. Once you get a big grant, of course, you're expected to participate in panels. You have to go on and be on NSF panels. And so I was. It's a great experience, tough, but a good experience. And the question came up, how can computational modeling be used better for socio-ecological sciences? It was clear that many people wanted to use it. Very few people understood it. So we were getting proposals that were not well informed about using this new kind of tool. And so in response, colleagues and I put together a pilot project with workshops and initial science gateway, internet science gateway, to try and find out why, how we could be more effective at using these new information processing tools for understanding complex social and ecological system dynamics. And it turned out that some of the most important things we could do were come up with ways to share our knowledge. This was, regular scientific papers and other things were not sufficient for people to be able to share what they've learned about how to use these tools. We needed to have new ways of knowledge exchange. And so ComSysNet, the full-blown version of it, was started in 2009 as an NSF RCN. And we've developed an online library for computational code. We provide education and training programs and focus on standards. And I'll talk about those in a minute. I want to do a quick shout out to the people here at ASU who are leading the core team for ComSysNet. This is a truly international project, but besides me, Marco Janssen, Alan Lee, and Ken Buto are all part of the leadership team of ComSysNet. And then we have a number of people, Calvin Pritchard, Christine Nguyen, Sean Bergen, Manuela Venegas, and Carlos Bustamante, who are all part of the core team supporting this. And then of course, it's also when you have an international executive board with ComSysNet. So a few stats, this is, like I say, has become in the past decade, over a decade now, a fairly substantial international scientific network. We have nearly 3,000 members around the world. We have a science gateway that you can go and see at comsys.net. In 2020, even with the coronavirus, you can see the hit there on the graph at the top. We had almost 32,000 users, individual users from nearly every country in the world logging in at one time or another to the gateway, with over 56,000 sessions in our gateway. The modeling library I talked about is arguably, maybe it is, the largest open access digital library repository for model code and social and ecological sciences, and actually maybe other sciences, natural sciences in the US at least. Over 850 models published there. People can get citations and DOIs. We had 110 new models in the last year, and it's heavily used with over 38,000 downloads of model code in the past year. So this is a pretty substantial resource. We provide educational resources and also now have an annual winter school in socio-ecological science modeling, which now is our 5th year, I think, this year. We had to go virtual, of course, this year. We had 40 participants from 20 countries. And we've had virtual conferences and jobs forums, professional development. So it's become a fairly substantial organization over the past decade. And of course has grown. On the left is the number of members in the network, and on the right is the number of models in the library. Interestingly, the number of models in the library seems to be growing exponentially, which reflects, I think, more the interest and use and importance of computational modeling more than anything else. That's important. A key aspect of ComSysNet is that early on we began working and partnering with other organizations that are also supporting modeling of kind of this coupled human earth systems, people in the natural sciences and social sciences, and trying to look at this challenge of how do we grow modeling infrastructure to help us understand these interactions, stuff I talked about at the very beginning of this talk. And to deal with this, a series of meetings were organized by AIMS, Analysis, Integration, and Modeling of the Earth System, CSDMS, Community Surface Dynamics Modeling System, and ComSysNet, to try and address the future of modeling of humans in the Earth system. And this is just a list of these models. I mean, these meetings, which were held in various places around the world, very successful, a lot of fun. Great to talk to people about them, about these issues. But there was actually a lot of very serious discussion. And how do we think about the future of modeling? And and a key issue was how do we try to integrate modeling of human systems and biophysical systems? Currently, they're largely modeled independently one another. Unlike the Medlin Project, you have atmospheric scientists and oceanographers, modeling the ocean, modeling the atmosphere, and you have economists and social scientists modeling human systems, but the two are not connected. So how do we integrate these things? How do we model across scales? Because our questions are not always global. They can be very, very local. They can be regional. How can we provide these tools in multi-scalar ways? How do we incorporate different conceptual approaches? A lot of the big modeling work is done in these big, well-funded government institutions in the global north and in first world countries. And that's, there's a lot of work that's been very good, but how do we bring in a much larger scientific community with many different kinds of ideas? Because this is understanding the Earth system as it is now is a global issue. And along with this is how do we democratize making this technology available so you don't have to be a member of a rich country and a rich university to have access to it. And of course, how do we create modeling flexible enough to provide the resilience to answer questions we don't know? A lot of the models that are out there now, bigger system models, were built to answer questions from a decade ago or 2 decades ago. And those are important questions, but we're facing new ones now. So how do we do this? A consensus of these meetings is that probably we need to look at a future that shifts from these big monolithic Earth system models that exist now, like out of NCAR and Hadley Research Center and Center in France, or PIC in Potsdam in Germany. And the same thing goes for large economic models. We need to shift from these things to kind of an evolving ecosystem of many different kinds of models, but ones that could be potentially connected together to answer big questions and could be focused to answer small questions. To do that, we need to shift from the current practice of creating one-off models to answer a question in a research team, and that's it, to models designed for use by others. That means the code needs to be accessible and discoverable by other people. It needs to be understandable. People need to reproduce what you've done in models. Right? It seems like that's simple, but it's not. If you were to go out and try to get models of geophysical systems or social systems and try to reuse them, you would find they're hard to find, hard to understand, and very hard to actually reproduce the work that other people have done. Only a tiny percent of the research that's published right now based on modeling science, the models are actually available. And of those, a much smaller percentage are put in a place where they're easily accessible and understandable. We need to leverage new technologies. to make models more easily reusable. There's ways to make them reusable using things like called containers and things, so that you don't have to be able to know how to compile models on from the command line on your computer and download a bunch of dependencies. And if we want to hook these together, have an evolving ecosystem, we need APIs, application programming interfaces. We need connectors that allow these to be hooked together in various ways, in ways that are widely understood. Right? And this includes ontologies, how we define things and how we do things. And we have to do this across multiple science domains. So we have to have people adopting these practices, not just in social sciences, but also ecological sciences, environmental sciences, atmospheric sciences, other geosciences. And so technology to do this is needed, but that's not sufficient. To actually carry out this kind of a plan for the future of modeling, we have to change how modeling science is done. And that's a social challenge of collective action. So it's good to have social scientists involved in this. How do we change science to create a new kind of future modeling? And that means we need new institutions to develop and administer standards, provide education, provide incentives. This is extra work. And to carry out some kind of a coordinated international effort, we need some kind of an organization. And so building out of these meetings that were held in the mid, after 2015, some of us have started to form something called the Open Modeling Foundation to try and serve as a meta-organization to help enable this kind of transformation of modeling science that's needed. And I'll put this up here, but I won't leave it long. This is just, this is part of the mission statement. This was initiated in June of 2018, a couple of years ago. The idea is it's a consortium of modeling organizations. That's the goal, that will kind of develop and administer a set of common standards that can be followed, best practices across many different scientific fields in developing models to help us understand the world we live in. And so since this time, we've had a series of meetings to start strategic planning. And we have one more planned in the first half of this year, maybe in May. These are strategic planning workshops to try and bring in the larger modeling community and multiple organizations to talk about how to go about this and how to form this international consortium. And hopefully by the end of this year, we'll have a formal organizational meeting and launch. We originally had these in-person meetings planned in great places. And as with everybody else, they've all had to go online. But still, we've had so far 46 different organizations have participated, representing thousands and thousands of modeling scientists around the world from all different areas, kinds of public and private institutions. We currently have some funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and an NSF proposal is pending to help move this forward. And because we were forced to move online, some of the things we had been thinking about, how to create a distributed governance, a distributed organization, international organization for standards, how would we make this work, right? So we were talking about how do we need to create some kind of an online platform to help this go. And so we've had to actually roll out a pilot version of this early, and we've used this in the meetings in the last year. So it's an online platform for distributed governance and standards making. It's built on top of GitHub. Those of you that have heard that, that's a collaboration platform that's openly available to people. And it gives us the opportunity to start putting out potential standards, requests for comments, get input from the larger community, and then have a governance to decide on these and make it all transparent. Keep records of all of the discussions and all the activities. And so this would be a completely transparent, open process that everybody could participate in. So this is what we want to avoid. I'm going to wind up here. And
whether the online discussions actually broadened participation.
They have. They actually have. We've been able to bring in more people than otherwise, and in fact, the reason we've scheduled them time-wise now in time to deal with different time zones. The first focused on the U.S., The second focused on kind of European time zones, and the one that's later this, actually the second, third, and fourth. The last one this is coming up will focus on Asia Pacific time zones to encourage participation from other people in the world who may not be able to physically be here. So anyway, I'll stop there and see what kinds of questions that people have. And I see a couple in the chat already.
So I think the easiest is if you just jump right in and ask your question rather than me trying to read it.
And I'll answer Susan's in the chat real quickly, which is how do you balance the need for standardization with the emergence of novelty? And the goal of the OMF is not to tell people how to model things, how to think about modeling, how to think about to represent the world, how to come up with important questions. It's more to come up with rules of engagement. How do you package your code and make it available so that other people can make use of it, and that your code could potentially be integrated with other people's code, right? So I think the idea is by turning this into an open ecosystem, we can hopefully increase the amount of novelty, right? The diversity of ideas that come in, that are in models. Right now, it's a small number of people making very large Earth system models, and they're really smart and they're very capable. But I think we could benefit by having many more people involved in this process. But to make this work, we can't just have a bunch of different individual models that just answer a question and go away. We need to put it in some kind of an environment where if you do something, other people can make use of what you do, can build on that work, can build it out and add it to other people's work and in new ways. And so that's the idea, is to kind of standardize the protocols and rules of engagement, but not the content and what people do. So I hope that helps.
Thanks, Michael. That's great. Just if I can just ask a quick follow-up question. So in some ways, again, this requires a change in the way that we value and reward this kind of work, right? Because the one-off work, the unique work, this is my model work is what often gets rewarded. And the fact that you might say, oh, I'm going to use this component from somebody else's model, I'm going to build on what's already been done, rather than creating my, my unique solution, requires a real culture change in the academy, doesn't it?
It does. So we've spent a lot of time in ComSysNet and in these larger discussions talking about this issue specifically. And so the idea is, how do we create a kind of both carrot and stick incentives to make it worth people's while? We can't depend on altruism. I mean, we can certainly appeal to it, and scientists tend to be, relatively cooperative, but everybody's busy. Like you said, what's the incentive for doing this? So what our thought is rather than create a totally new incentive system, we'd be best to try and plug into the existing incentive system of science in the academy. The one that, like the kind used for other research reporting and publications. So ComSysNet, for example, and CSDMS and others offer citations for all published models. ComSysNet now does peer review of model code. We award DOIs for peer-reviewed models. And then we're trying to create a set of badges that could be applied to journal papers for things like open code, documentation, reproducibility. And there's new standards. NISO has just come out with new standards for badging. And so we'd like to have these public markers of good practices. Now, the second part of this is those have to be recognized for professional advancement. But if we can get a large enough consortium of organizations that represent thousands of scientists around the world, a number of those people are the ones that sit on the committees that actually advance people. So, we're hoping we would have enough leverage to help move academia into a way to start to recognize properly published models, just like they recognize properly published research in journal papers. And then the third part of this is to work with journals and funding agencies to require people to make their code available in a quality format somewhere. in an open access repository as part of a requirement for funding and for publication. So part of the idea of putting together a consortium is to, if we get everyone to agree to these kind of rules, this kind of protocols, right? These are institutions, then we can begin to make this transformation. So you're absolutely right. I think that's a key part of this. And that's why some of this has not worked before, is we haven't had social scientists talking about understanding how science is an actual social practice, and how do we understand this as a social practice.
Thank you.
Brian, there are some developing standards. He's asking about standards for connecting models. There are some developing standards both for connecting models to each other and connecting models to data. There's a number of ones that are out there. So I think, again, at least my idea and the people I've talked with in OMF discussions, it's not so much that OMF would create and force people to follow some standard, but would identify and promote workable standards, and then make those available, and then recognize people who use those standards. And again, that starts the feedbacks to help people find value in developing those standards if they get recognition for it, official recognition, globally, and encourages them to improve this. There are other organizations like Open Geospatial Consortium that do this kind of stuff, so who we're working with. Other questions? And you can speak also, it's okay. We've got this set up so you can unmute yourself and ask or raise a hand or something or other too. Try to make this a little bit more like a room, even though we're not in a physical room here.
Michael, can I ask about the funding structure of things like ComSysNet and stuff like that? How is that funded for the long-term stability of the platform? Like, what is the strategy there?
It is a challenge. It's a big challenge, and one we're facing right now. We've had NSF grants. We have proposals in for additional NSF grants, but we're also looking for private foundation funding. That's one reason we have some money from Sloan Foundation. We went through there's an organization called Science Gateways Community Institute, and we participated in kind of a workshop with them to talk about long-term funding. And so we've got some ideas, and we have not implemented those, but to try and think, we don't want to sell what we're doing. We want this to be open. That's just what makes it difficult. You want open access to these things. So how can you contribute? How can you generate funding? And they were pretty good. We have kind of some ideas in terms of click donation pages, and there's certain kinds of add-ons that we could begin to do for training and education that we might be able to monetize. The idea is not to find a single source, but to try and diversify funding portfolios for something like this. So this is an issue faced by regularly these kinds of organizations and science gateways. How do we continue supporting the great team that we have here at ASU right now? And of course, ASU is actually providing resources. They're providing some salaries for some of the people like me, and Marco, Alan. They're providing some computational resources. We have, right now, all of ComSysNet runs on Compute Canada. So we have support. So that's where all the big servers are that support it. So we have diversified our support to some extent, but we need to do a lot more. The key is diversification. I think that's what it sounds like.
Thanks.
Oh, thanks, Susan. Yeah, I have to follow up on that. Other questions? I mean, that's a key question, Matt, and something I struggle with regularly. But not alone. Other people do too. I'm sure you do with the TDAR, for example. So, other questions, thoughts? Well, I'm happy to talk with anybody individually about ComSysNet. Log in and take a look if you're interested in models. Beginning in April, we put up a new splash page on our home screen specifically focused on COVID-19. One thing I did mention was discussions in the ComSys Executive Board last spring about some kind of a statement about making epidemiological models for COVID open, which they were not. A lot of them are closed source, secretive models. Evolved from a board discussion into talking with people that have participated in the Open Modeling Foundation initiative. And that ended up with a letter in Science signed by over 30 modeling organizations around the world calling for transparency and open access to COVID-19 models, which seems to have had actually some impact on, because there were a number that were made openly accessible after that. So it's given us a chance to do, a platform to do additional things. And we hope that the Open Modeling Foundation, a larger platform consortium, will allow us to, lay the groundwork for the kind of transformational science that's needed to better understand and manage the complex world we've created and now have to live in.
Okay, any other questions? If not, let's thank Michael for a fascinating overview, both of the concrete work on applying complex systems, as well as the important institution building aspects that make this all happen. Then we hope to see you again in 2 weeks for Eric's talk on smart cities.
Thanks,
everybody.